Greetings, my friend. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm Matt Schifferly. Another video to help you be fit and live free. And today is a recommendation video on how you can get more out of your isometric training with simpler pieces of equipment for quantification. It's also kind of a bit of review of several pieces of equipment from my friends over at Vector Athletics. These are their new fabric bands, which are similar to like your classic resistance bands, but they're much more ergonomic, much higher quality, and they've got a lot of benefits specifically for isometric training that I wanted to share with you. I've been experimenting more with utilizing bands for the sake of quantifiable isometric training, because in most cases, if we're utilizing isometrics, we have to have some sort of like a free weight or something where we're just kind of holding it in place, but then that takes quite a bit of poundages and it's hard to regulate a little bit because we can't push directly against pins like in the old school isometric racks. You can use an iso trainer or a lot of other devices out there that just utilize a strap, but now you don't have any quantification and not a whole lot of adjustment there. And things like the Isomax and now the new coming Isoflex are great options, but they're more on the higher price scale of things. So utilizing bands gives us some unique advantages where it makes quantifiable isometrics a little bit more accessible, especially if you already have these things laying around. And the biggest advantage of utilizing bands for the sake of isometrics is that you can apply resistance to your hands, your feet, or your legs and stuff in various directions, and you can just hold it in place, which technically makes it a yielding isometric as opposed to like a straight up overcoming isometric where you're pushing or pulling against something that cannot possibly move. So one, you're getting over that cortical inhibition, so you're not inhibited in your neural drive at all, but it also gives you something that increases that resistance, so you can theoretically push against a very high degree of resistance, creating a lot of tension in the muscle, holding it for a long time under tension. But if you lose the ability to generate that much tension, you're going to naturally, of course, shrink or shorten down the band a little bit. So it's giving you some sort of kinesthetic feedback on whether or not you're generating enough tension where that quantifiable nature really comes into play. And don't worry if it's not a numerical quantification either. You just need some sort of way to kind of gauge resistance. And this, their fabric bands come in a pack of 4, which I recommend if you're really going for isometrics, you may want to get 2 packs, just because remember that isometric training can generate an ungodly amount of tension, particularly in strong moves like for the legs, deadlifts, presses, that sort of thing. So you may need 2 packs of these, but nonetheless, these are pretty beefy, heavy-duty bands, and while they don't have a number associated with them, you're certainly going to be able to recognize if you're utilizing a heavier load just by using multiples of the bands or using the heavier bands, or just stretching the band out further and getting a bigger range of motion where you're holding it isometrically. And Max over at Vector Athletics has really done a great job creating kind of an entire system of dynamic and isometric components to it. Of course, I did a review. These are their Vector grips, and these slip very easily into the band, so you're not having to death grip just the band itself, although these are a lot more comfortable than classic latex bands on the skin. They're not gonna feel like they're creating a sort of abrasion or rubbing or anything. They're very comfortable if you wanna like loop it over your back or your shoulders and stuff. And they also rotate in the handle a lot easier as well for things like curls, tricep presses, overhead presses and stuff. Good knurling on the grips, so it's creating much more of an effective band system for isometrics. Plus, if you hold isometrically, and then you can immediately go into dynamics in order to kind of burn out the muscle to that very high degree to stimulate more hypertrophy. That's a big advantage of bands, is it doesn't have to be used just for an isometric or dynamic. You can literally change from one to the other in the same set and get the benefits of both worlds. I've also been utilizing these. These are what they call their 8-sling utility straps. And these are kind of one of those simple devices that just does a whole bunch of things. You can create all sorts of new different grips, different ways of holding onto things. You can use it for, of course, ankle cuffs. You can loop it around your wrists if you have like a an injured hand or a weaker grip, different types of hand angles, kind of works like a good tricep rope with the bands. It's just one of these things that you can add in addition to the handles themselves, that can really give you some more options in how you're using them for going well beyond just a simple chain and bar setup for isometrics or dynamic band training. And also Vector Athletics has their squat belt, which I've been using. This is one of the best squat belts on the market today. And I don't have it on hand, but they also have a platform that you can use with the bands. And if you're really serious about isometric training, you definitely want to have the bands running underneath something stable that you can have a lot more that stability and not feel like the bands are pulling up on the outside edges of your feet, particularly if you're doing squats, deadlifts, because remember, you're going to generate a lot of resistance with these things. And I certainly am going to be getting one of those platforms, so I'll do a review on that one as well. But the point I'm making here is that Vector Athletics has a lot of tools now at our disposal with the fabric bands and the handles and everything else that comprehensively can create one heck of an isometric strength training system. Do bear in mind, of course, that bands have their limitations when it comes to creating enough resistance for isometrics, particularly like if you're doing squats, you may want to really strap up with quite a few of those bands, because if you only have resistance at the very top of the range of motion, you may not have the resistance where you want it where you're doing the isometrics. Now the fabric bands are kind of great because they don't have nearly quite as steep of a resistance curve as the classic latex bands, where you have like no resistance when you're starting out, you have a modest amount of resistance, and then finally at the full stretch, that's where you finally have the resistance you need. And whether or not that's the position you want to be in for the resistance you need in the isometrics could be really hit or miss. But the fabric bands have a much more gradual resistance curve, and it also goes for a much longer distance. It doesn't have just this immediate stop to it, which can give you a lot more versatility for finding and fine-tuning your position. Just bear in mind, again, that you probably want to loop up several bands at a time, particularly for strong exercises. So yeah, I'm very excited about these, and Max always builds the best stuff too as far as attention to detail. Even the bag that these things comes in has a nice embroidered logo to it. It's not just some cheap screen printed thing. He really does a great job making sure every little detail is high quality for all of his products. But at the end of the day, if you want to get into band quantified isometrics, you certainly don't need any of this equipment. I just think it's the best on the market. But if you've got bands hanging around, if you've got some stretch bands or even some TheraBands and stuff, give it a try. Because if you're interested in quantifiable isometrics, and all you got is maybe an iso loop or a yoga strap or maybe an iso trainer, and you want to get a little bit more of that kinesthetic feedback, then bands can be a really great way to play around with it. Just again, remember that you're gonna really have to put a lot of resistance as far as the number of bands or the thickness of the bands for the exercises, because if you can hold it with a fully stretched out position for, I'd say, more than 20-30 seconds, you probably want to go heavier, particularly if you want to emphasize building strength. But it is a fun thing to do, and for your isometric training, mixing in the isometrics and the dynamics, and it can be a good kind of niche way to practice isometric training. Love to hear your thoughts down below. I'll be making more videos on some of these exercises as well, so make sure you stay tuned, subscribe, like, shares, all that great stuff. Greatly appreciated. Best of luck in your workouts this week. Be fit and live free.